Sometimes silence feels deafening. After my husband George passed away 3 years ago, our home in Cheyenne became a maze of memories. Every corner told its own story. His old baseball cap still hung on the hook by the door, as if he might walk in at any moment. His best dad mug sat on the kitchen shelf, now coated in a thin layer of dust. Even the old vinyl record player in the living room, which used to fill our home with jazz melodies, stood silent now, as if unwilling to break the stillness. I woke up early not because I had something exciting to do, but out of habit. My days were filled with mundane tasks: making the bed, dusting, watering my neglected houseplants. It was like living the same day on repeat, with nothing ever changing. I went to the store, smiled at neighbors who politely asked how I was doing, and returned home to spend the evening on the couch, flipping through old photos, remembering George. It hurt, but forgetting him would have been even worse. One morning, I decided to take a walk in the local park. The sky was clear, and a light breeze rustled the tree branches, as if someone were trying to whisper words of comfort to me. I strolled along the path, paying little attention to the people passing by, until I noticed him, a large golden retriever. He stood nearby, as if waiting for me to see him. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his warm brown eyes looked at me with such kindness that I stopped in my tracks. "Hey there, buddy," I said, crouching down. The dog slowly approached, rested his head on my knees, and let out a quiet sigh. My hand instinctively reached out to stroke his soft fur. That simple gesture, that touch, was the first real moment of comfort I'd felt in a long time. "You must be lost," I continued, glancing around for his owner, but the park was nearly empty. No one nearby, just the two of us. The dog followed me all the way to the park exit, staying close by my side. I took him to the nearest shelter, hoping someone was already searching for their missing friend. The shelter staff assured me they would do everything possible to find his owners, and I, though heavy-hearted, said goodbye. That night turned out to be the most restless I'd had in months. I couldn't stop thinking about him, his gaze, his silent companionship. It felt like he had been sent to me at the moment I needed support the most. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I got out of bed, poured myself a cup of tea, and realized I had to do something I hadn't done in a long time: listen to my heart. The next morning, I called the shelter and asked if I could adopt him if no one claimed him. They told me the dog was still there and no one had come forward. My heart raced at the thought that I might give him a new home. An hour later, I was standing at the shelter's door. The dog saw me immediately, got up, and wagged his tail, as if he had never doubted I'd return. His name was Max, the shelter workers told me, checking his old collar. Max, the name suited him perfectly. We went home together, and for the first time in a long while, my heart felt a little lighter. That evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. Max lay at my feet as I stroked his head, listening to his quiet breathing. That day was the first step towards something new. I didn't know yet what that new would look like, but for the first time in months, I felt it was possible. Max looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed in my life for a long time: hope. Not long after Max came into my life, I realized we were both stuck in our own little world. Each day was like the last. Morning walks around the neighborhood, slow evenings on the porch. Max, despite his loyalty and energy, seemed to adjust to my quiet, mundane life. But one day, everything changed. In the attic, a place I rarely visited, I found an old box filled with photos of trips George and I had taken. We had always dreamed of traveling across the country, but managed to visit only a few states. As I flipped through the pictures, memories flooded back: laughing by the shores of Lake Tahoe, grilling on a cabin porch in Tennessee. Each photo seemed to hum with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Suddenly, an idea struck me. Why not take Max and go on a road trip? It could be our fresh start, a way to shake things up and give life a second chance. The next morning, I rented a camper. It was small but cozy, with a bed by the window and a tiny kitchen. I prepared everything we would need: a map with places George and I had once planned to visit, a bowl for Max, his favorite toy, and plenty of supplies. Our first stop was Colorado, in the mountains George had loved. We drove along winding roads that hugged the hills, and I enjoyed watching Max stick his head out the window, catching the breeze. His joy was infectious, and I felt something inside me begin to thaw. We parked by a small mountain lake where I prepared lunch. Max dashed along the shore, chasing dragonflies. I watched him, unable to suppress a smile. In that moment, for the first time in years, I felt the beauty of being present. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, a man approached us. He was tall, with reddish hair, holding a fishing rod and smiling warmly. "Good evening," he said. "Beautiful dog you've got there. Retrievers make the best companions." "Thank you," I replied, feeling slightly awkward at the unexpected conversation. "This is Max. Are you a fisherman?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Yes, and a traveler," he replied, his eyes lighting up as he spoke. "My name's Brian. I've been living out of my van and wandering for years now." We started talking, Brian sharing stories about his travels, the places he'd seen, and the people he'd met along the way. I told him about George, about how Max had brought me back to life when everything felt lost. When the stars lit up the night sky, he suddenly took my hand. I froze for a moment, but then warmth spread through me. "Life doesn't end, Linda," he said softly but firmly. "It just takes a new route." I smiled, and he leaned in to kiss my cheek. It wasn't passionate, but tender, not flirtatious, but understanding. Max snorted softly, as if giving his approval. That night marked the beginning of something new, not just for me, but for my heart. "A traveler," he said. "My name's Brian. I've been living out of my van and wandering for years now." We started talking. Brian shared stories about his travels, the places he'd seen, and the people he'd met along the way. I told him about George and how Max had brought me back to life when everything had felt so still and hopeless. When the stars lit up the night sky, he suddenly took my hand. I froze for a moment, but then warmth spread through me. "Life doesn't end, Linda," he said softly, but firmly. "It just takes a new route." I smiled, and he leaned in to kiss my cheek. It wasn't passionate, but tender, understanding, not flirtatious. Max snorted softly as if giving his approval. That night marked the beginning of something new, not just for me, but for my heart. Our journey with Max picked up pace. Each new day started with uncertainty and ended with a kind of tired satisfaction I hadn't felt in ages. Colorado gave way to the wide open plains of Kansas, then to the green valleys of Missouri. We didn't make rigid plans, just followed our intuition, guided by maps, tips from strangers, and sometimes even the direction of Max's eager gaze. On our third day in Missouri, we stopped in a tiny town called Hanley. Its main street hosted a lively market where locals sold homemade honey pies, crafts, and fresh produce. Max, curious as ever, sniffed everything in sight, drawing smiles from passing farmers. "That's the politest retriever I've ever seen," said an elderly woman in a wide-brimmed hat, offering me a warm smile. Her name was Etta, and she sold homemade apple cider. "Well, he's a gentleman," I replied, pouring myself a cup of her cider. Etta seemed to believe there was nothing better than a good conversation. We talked about the weather, her cider recipe, how she once rescued a quail, and even her youngest son, who dreamed of becoming an actor. "Brings you here, dear?" she finally asked. I told her about George, about our home, and about how Max had become my lifeline. Eta listened intently, as if she understood. "Every word. You're making the right choice, Linda," she said, pouring me another cup of cider. "Sometimes the road isn't just a path, it's a way to find yourself." We said our goodbyes, but her words lingered. They made me think maybe this journey was more than just a trip. The next day we moved on. Max snapped on the passenger seat as I enjoyed the wind streaming through the open window. Missouri's roads led us to a campground. By a river, I parked under a giant oak tree and Max immediately bolted out of the camper to explore as I set up a small table and prepared a simple lunch. A young couple approached. Rachel and Tom were travelers from Minnesota on their honeymoon. We struck up a conversation, and they invited me to join their campfire that evening. When night fell, I joined them by the fire, Max curled up at my feet, warming his paws by the flames. Rachel played an old folk song on her ukulele, and Tom shared stories about how they met in college. Their youthful energy was contagious. Linda, Tom suddenly said, "You're searching for something on this road, too, aren't you?" I paused. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was searching for something or trying to let go of what was holding me back. Maybe, I said honestly, or I'm trying to let go. Well, the road can heal, Rachel said, but only if you let it. Her words stayed with me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Max's paws patting across the camper floor. He looked at me with an expression that said, "Ready for a new day." We continued our journey. Max roamed the camper, sniffing at bags and AA's, sticking his nose out the window to catch the breeze. The day ended in Illinois, where we stopped at a riverside farm. I parked the camper next to a field where cows grazed, and Max started around like a puppy for the first time in a long while. I laughed freely. Later, as evening shadows lengthened, I sat by the river and thought of George. He would have loved this trip. Max quietly approached, resting his head on my lap with a soft sigh. His warm, understanding gaze was all I needed at that moment. I scratched behind his ears and whispered, "Thank you, Max. You're the best companion I could ask for." That evening stayed with me. It held everything: simplicity, the beauty of nature, Max's warmth, and the sense that my life was truly beginning to change. Coming back home felt strange after weeks on the road with Max. Our little house in Cheyenne seemed different. It was no longer the trap of memories that had held me captive. Instead, it felt like a starting point for something new, a sanctuary waiting for its own transformation. Max seemed to sense the change immediately. He dashed around the yard, which had been neglected and lifeless before the trip, acting like a king surveying his reclaimed domain. I watched him chase a ball through the grass and felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. On our first evening back, I treated myself to a quiet dinner on the porch. Max lay by my side, his head resting on his paws, his eyes following every move as I ladled soup into a bowl. His calmness felt almost symbolic. We had been through something significant together, and now we were simply enjoying the moment. The next day, I decided it was time to make some changes in the house. George's old chair, which had always stood by the window, I moved to another room, but instead of feeling pain as I had feared, I felt relief. His belongings no longer felt like anchors holding me down. They became part of my story, a history I could now cherish with love, not sorrow. Began sorting through the photos from our journey. Each one captured a moment that had brought me joy. Max sniffing flowers in Kansas, the two of us sitting by the fire in Missouri, him leaping for a stick in Illinois. Arranged them into an album and titled it Our Journey. A few weeks after our return, I invited neighbors over something I hadn't done in years. They noticed the change in me right away, commenting on the light in my eyes that had been missing for so long. We shared tea, laughter, and stories, and for the first time, the house felt truly alive again. I realized that a home isn't just walls and furniture, it's also the people who come into it. One evening during a walk with Max along our street, I noticed the stars shining more brightly than I remembered. I stopped to look up, and Max sat beside me, his warm gaze following mine. "You've changed my life, buddy," I said, stroking his head. "Thank you for being here." Max let out a quiet snort as if he understood. At that moment, I realized that life doesn't have to look the way it once did. It can be different and still just as beautiful. Max and I had found our path, our home, and a new sense of purpose. Every day was no longer just a cycle of waiting, but a new chapter to embrace. Our journey hadn't ended, it had simply taken on a new shape, and I knew deep down that new horizons awaited us.